At 11 in the morning on a wet Tuesday in Boston, the rain had just stopped and Quincy Street was moving again. Cars threw water off the yellow line, people stepped around the puddles without looking down, and nobody had time for the man sitting on the ground between two garbage cans. He was somewhere in his 30s, tall even sitting down, wearing what used to be an expensive coat before somebody pulled him out of a river with it. His hands were shaking around a piece of soaked bread he hadn't eaten yet. There was a thin scar above his left eyebrow, and if you'd asked him his own name, he couldn't have told you. 3 women came out of a lunch place across the street in heels and bright dresses. One of them lifted her phone and started filming him. The other 2 laughed loud enough that he heard it. He didn't look up. He'd stopped looking up hours ago. Then, a yellow umbrella tilted over his head, and the rain that had just started falling again stopped touching him. Delaney Shaw was 27, and she'd been walking home for the better part of an hour because she couldn't afford to put money on her transit card. She'd just finished the morning cleaning shift, and she had another one waiting for her that evening. In her bag was a container of leftover food she'd asked for at the staff canteen. That was her daughter's lunch. Her umbrella had a cracked handle held together with tape. She wasn't a woman with anything to spare. She stopped anyway. She crouched down, put the container into his hands and said, "Eat it. It's still warm." One of the women across the street laughed and said, "Look at that. A beggar feeding a beggar." Delaney didn't turn around. She just tilted the umbrella a little further over him. She had no idea who she was kneeling in front of. She didn't know that every man working the docks in this city knew his face, that a few days earlier he'd signed something that got him sent off a bridge, or that the man she'd just handed her daughter's lunch to could have bought every building on that street before breakfast. All she saw was somebody sitting in the rain that nobody stopped for, and she had no idea why he was crying, because he didn't know either. Not yet. If this story moves you, hit that like button and share it with someone who still believes in kindness. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Your support means everything to us. Now let's go back to that wet street in Boston and find out what happened after Delaney Shaw stopped walking. 3 days before that rain-soaked street, the man sitting between 2 garbage cans was still the man whose name made the entire Boston waterfront lower its voice. The Castellano family council chamber occupied the top floor of an old building in the North End, and at the center of the room stood a long wooden table, darkened by time, its surface carved with 3 lines that everyone seated around it had known by heart since childhood. This family never owes anyone. Blood can't buy loyalty. Whoever sits in the presiding chair must be named by the council. Gianni Castellano sat at the head of the table, one hand resting on a worn leather-bound ledger. Before him stood a silver-haired man, with both arms hanging at his sides, sweat soaking the collar of his shirt. He was responsible for the Southern Dock branch, and for the past 3 months, the wages reaching the night shift, stevedores had always been lower than the amounts recorded in the books. He began to explain. Gianni raised one finger, and the man fell silent at once. The entire room went silent with him. Gianni didn't shout. He never shouted. He asked only one question, very slowly. How many years the man had been sitting at this table. The silver-haired man gave him a number. Gianni nodded and went on to say that in all those years, his father had stood beside the man at his wedding, and Gianni himself had held the man's son at his baptism. Then he told him to stand up and leave. Trembling, the man asked what Gianni intended to do to him. Gianni closed the ledger and said he wasn't going to do anything at all, except that from this moment forward, the man's name would no longer appear in the book, and from this harbor to the farthest edge of the city, no one would hire him for even one more day. He added that if his father had been the one sitting there, the man's wife would have been wearing black that very night, so he ought to walk out that door and consider himself fortunate. The silver-haired man left, and no one in the room turned to watch him go. When the door closed, Gianni placed a thick stack of documents on the table and told the council that he'd sign them. Every family asset would be transferred into legitimate legal entities within 1 year. Every unrecorded lending operation would be shut down. Every act of forced collection would stop, and the ledgers bearing the borrowers' names would be closed forever. He said his father had built their name with methods for which men of his generation had been given no other choice. But Gianni's generation did have a choice, and he didn't want any child who carried the Castellano name to grow up feeling that the family name was a sentence handed down upon them. Half the room remained silent. Some people lowered their eyes to the tabletop. Others looked at one another. Then laughter came from the far end of the table. Rocco Castellano leaned back in his chair, laughing easily as though he'd just heard an amusing story, and asked his older brother what would be left of their name once all of those things were gone. Gianni looked at him. He said the 3 lines carved into the surface of that table would remain, and to him, that was enough. Rocco was still smiling, but the smile never reached his eyes. He told his brother that he spoke beautifully, then rose and walked out before the meeting had ended. No one tried to stop him. A young woman sat near the far end of the room, the daughter of an allied family, and throughout the entire meeting she didn't say a single word. She only stared down at the wood before her. That night, Gianni left the building alone, as he often did. He called his grandmother on the way home, and once again she asked when he was finally going to marry, while he told her he'd come to dinner the following week, and the 2 of them could talk about it then. Those were the last words she heard from him for a very long time. His car climbed onto the Mystic Bridge as the rain began to fall. The brake pedal struck the floor with nothing there to stop it. The guardrail broke. Then there was only the black water below, and the 2 beams of his headlights sank deeper, grew dimmer, and finally disappeared altogether. On the opposite bank, Rocco stood in the darkness and watched the surface of the water close, and he told the man beside him that all his life, people had called him someone else's younger brother, but from that night on, there would be no one left for him to stand behind. 3 days later, not far from that place, a woman tilted her yellow umbrella down to shelter a man who couldn't remember his own name. Delaney sat beside him a little longer, waiting until he had finished all the food in the container. Then she asked where he lived, so she could take him home. He lifted his eyes to her, and there was something in them that she wouldn't forget for many months afterward, something people carried only when everything had just been taken from them, even their own name. He said he didn't know. She asked what his name was. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then said in a voice rough with strain that he didn't know that either. She asked whether he remembered anything at all. He remained silent for a very long time before saying that he remembered only water, so much water, and the sound of something breaking apart. She looked at the wound beginning to close on his head, looked at his hands still trembling, and understood that if she stood up and walked away now, he would still be sitting in that same place tonight. She held out her hand. He stared at it for a moment as though he wasn't sure it was meant for him, then took it and tried to rise. He was much taller than she was, and once he managed to stand upright, she had to brace her shoulder beneath his arm just to support him. They walked. She didn't have enough money for a cab, and even if she had, no one would have agreed to carry a man who looked the way he did. The distance back to Dorchester was longer than she'd expected because every few hundred steps, he had to stop, lean against a wall, and breathe. Once, he told her to keep going and not trouble herself over him anymore. She said she'd already come halfway, and abandoning the effort now would make all of it a waste. He didn't argue. A light rain began to fall again, and she kept the yellow umbrella tilted almost entirely toward him, letting the rain run down one side of her coat for the rest of the way without once shifting it back. When they passed through the light spilling from a storefront, she noticed a thin silver chain beneath the collar of his shirt. She asked whether she could see it, and he nodded. She drew it out. It was a small silver locket, old, its edges worn smooth from being held too many times over, too many years. A single letter was engraved on the back, the letter G, and beneath it was a line written in a language she couldn't read. The slanting characters faded almost beyond recognition. She asked whether it belonged to him. He said he didn't know, but when he'd awakened beneath the riverbank, it had already been around his neck, and it was the only thing he had left. She placed the locket carefully back inside his shirt, as though she were returning something fragile. It was fully dark by the time they arrived. Her apartment was in the basement of an old row house, reached by several steps leading down to the door, and a yellow notice was still taped to that door, one she had deliberately avoided reading again for the past few days. She helped him sit on the steps, then stood there with the key in her hand, without putting it into the lock. She remained that way for a long time. In her mind was her daughter waiting for her at the neighbor's apartment. In her mind was the container of food she'd just given away, even though it was supposed to have been the little girl's lunch. In her mind was the yellow notice on the door, the evening shift she was supposed to work, and the drawer full of bills she no longer dared to open. She knew very well that she had no right to take responsibility for one more person. She knew what people would say if they saw her bringing a strange man like him into her home. He seemed to understand what she was thinking, because he said softly that he could sit outside and that she should go in. Delaney turned and looked at him. He sat on the steps with his hands clasped together to keep them from shaking, and he wouldn't look at her, exactly as he hadn't raised his head when those 3 women had laughed. She put the key into the lock and turned it. The door opened onto darkness. In a calm voice, as though speaking of something that had grown old inside her, she told him that once, she too had sat alone in the street the way he was sitting now, and she'd remained there for a very long time. Then she stepped down one stair, reached out to help him, and added that no one had come for her. The apartment had only one room divided by a cloth curtain, a small stove set against the wall, and an old armchair Delaney had dragged home from the sidewalk the year before. She turned on the light, and beneath that weak yellow glow, she saw him clearly for the first time. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, his pants were caked with dried mud, and a bruise ran along the ribs on his left side, something he hadn't mentioned once during the entire walk. She heated water, gave him a towel and a cup of hot tea, then told him to stay right where he was because she had to step next door for a moment. When she came back, Mrs. Willa Petrosky was standing in the doorway, holding the little girl's hand with one hand and a bag of crayons with the other. She looked over Delaney's shoulder into the apartment and didn't say a word, but the crease between her brows said plenty. Junie didn't frown. She was 5 years old, her fingers still stained green, and she stared at the man sitting in the armchair with the direct, unguarded curiosity only children possess. Then she looked up and asked her mother whether he was her new friend. Delaney froze for a heartbeat. The man in the chair looked up as well. Then she smiled and said yes. He was her friend, and he was sick, so he would be staying there for a few days. Junie nodded, as though that made perfect sense, then waved to him, and he waved back. His hand was still trembling, but he waved anyway. Mrs. Willa cleared her throat and said she was going home, but she spoke to Delaney in a tone they both understood to mean that this wasn't over. Delaney took the little girl to wash her hands, changed her clothes, finished telling her the part of last night's story they'd left unfinished, then tucked the blanket around her and sat there stroking her hair until she fell asleep. By the time Delaney pulled the curtain closed behind her and stepped back into the room, it was nearly 10 o'clock. The man was still sitting exactly where she'd left him, the cup of tea gone cold in his hands, and she watched him for several seconds before realizing that something wasn't right. There were 4 places to sit in the apartment. He hadn't chosen the chair near the stove where it was warm, and he hadn't chosen the place near the window where the streetlight spilled in. He had chosen the armchair in the farthest corner, pressed tightly against the wall, with his back flat to it, and his body angled slightly so he wasn't directly in front of the window. And while she stood there watching him, his eyes flicked toward the front door exactly twice, so quickly that she would have missed it if she hadn't already been looking. She asked why he was sitting that way. He didn't understand. She said he'd backed himself all the way into the corner, turned his back to the wall, and kept watching the door. He looked down at where he was sitting, as though he were noticing his own position for the first time. Then he looked up and said he didn't know. He said that when he'd walked in, he hadn't thought about it at all. His feet had carried him there on their own, and his body had settled into that position by itself. He was quiet for a moment, then added more softly that some things inside him were still completely intact, while everything else had disappeared, and he didn't know what those remaining things were. Delaney didn't know how to answer. She only told him to rest and that they would deal with it tomorrow. She pulled out her thin mattress and spread it on the floor beside where Junie slept, then told him to lie down there while she took the chair. He protested, saying he could sleep on the floor, and that after spending the past several nights on the street, he was used to it. She said that in this home, she was the one in charge, and when the person who owned the place spoke, the guest listened. He looked at her for a moment, then did as she said. That night, Delaney lay curled in the old armchair with her coat pulled over her eyes open and fixed on the ceiling. She listened to her daughter's steady breathing behind the curtain. She listened to the strange man turning over on her mattress, and she thought about what she would have to say to Mrs. Willa tomorrow, and what she would have to say to herself the day after that. The next morning, Delaney woke before dawn, as she did every day, and when she returned from work close to noon, the man had already washed himself, and was sitting on the steps outside the door, because he said it didn't feel right to remain alone inside her home. She told him to come in, then pulled from the kitchen drawer the small pair of scissors she used to cut Junie's hair. She told him to sit in the chair, spread an old newspaper beneath his feet, and began cutting. His hair hung past his ears, matted and stiff with dried mud, and she had to work very slowly so she wouldn't pull and hurt him. He sat perfectly still the entire time, never asking what kind of cut she was giving him, never moving even once. When she finished, she took an old shirt from the closet, the one shirt she had kept for years while everything else had been sold or given away, and handed it to him, without explaining whom it had belonged to. He put it on. It was slightly tight across the shoulders. Then he turned around, and Delaney stepped back half a pace. The man standing before her was no longer the man beside the garbage cans. His jaw was sharply defined, his nose straight, and his pale gray eyes met hers with such quiet steadiness that she was the first to look away. She stood there with the scissors in her hand and thought that this man couldn't possibly be a beggar. She asked whether he remembered anything more. He shook his head. She said she couldn't keep calling him you forever. She sat down across from him, looked at the silver locket showing beneath his collar, looked at the letter G engraved on the back, then lifted her eyes to his gray ones and said she would call him Gray for now, only until he remembered his real name. He repeated the name once, slowly, as though testing whether it fit him. Then he said, "All right." Mrs. Willa came over that afternoon, and she didn't waste time circling the subject. She set her bag on the table, pulled out a chair, sat directly in front of them, and asked Delaney what she intended to use to feed another mouth. Delaney told her not to speak that way. Mrs. Willa said she wasn't joking. She was asking seriously. Then she turned to Gray and told him she had nothing against him, that none of this was his fault, but that he ought to know whose home he was staying in. She said this girl had grown up with no one, no father and no mother, moved from one house to another until she was old enough to care for herself, and on the day she walked through the last door carrying her bag, there hadn't been anyone waiting for her outside. She said Delaney had married, and then that man had left when her belly was already swollen, disappeared without a word, and without leaving a single dollar. She said little Junie had been born with a heart that didn't beat in the same rhythm as other children's hearts, and now she needed an operation, but the surgeon capable of performing it wasn't covered by the insurance plan. If they waited through the insurance system, the waiting list was so long that Mrs. Willa didn't dare say the length of it aloud in front of the child's mother. She said there had already been several times when the little girl had been rushed to the emergency room, and every visit had added another stack of bills, until the debt had grown larger than Delaney's entire yearly income. She said Delaney worked 2 shifts a day, walked home because she couldn't bear to spend money on the train, begged for leftovers from the cafeteria to bring back to her daughter, and still managed to bring a stranger into her home. She said she couldn't understand her at all. Delaney remained still from beginning to end, both hands resting in her lap, and she didn't argue once because there was nothing she could argue against. When Mrs. Willa finished, the room stayed silent for a very long time. Gray didn't say anything. He didn't ask questions, didn't offer comfort, didn't say that everything would somehow be all right. He only looked down at Delaney's hands resting in her lap, hands with hard calluses at the base of her fingers and cracked skin at the tips from dishwater, the hands of a 27-year-old woman that looked as though they belonged to someone twice her age. He looked for so long that Delaney finally drew her hands back and hid them beneath the table. Mrs. Willa stood, picked up her bag, and started for home, then turned at the door and told Delaney that she'd spoken harshly because she was worried, not because she hated her. Delaney said she knew. Only after the door had closed did Gray speak, and he asked just one question: when the debt was due. Delaney looked at him and said it had been overdue for a long time. That evening, Delaney went to her dishwashing shift as usual, and she had barely hung her coat on the hook when the shift manager leaned through the doorway and said the owner wanted to see her in his office. Delaney wiped her hands on her apron and went upstairs. Hollis Vandermeer owned the entire chain of restaurants along the waterfront, not just this one, and he rarely came down to the kitchen. So in the 3 years she had worked there, the number of times he had called her by name could be counted on one hand. He invited her to sit. He poured her a glass of water and pushed it toward her. He asked how her little girl had been lately, asked whether she was getting enough sleep, and said she looked exhausted. His voice was gentle, polite, almost kind. And that was what sent a chill down Delaney's spine, not the thing he was about to say. Then he opened a drawer, took out a stack of papers, and placed it on the desk facing her. He said he had ordered someone to gather everything together. All her debts, both the money she had borrowed through him and the unpaid hospital bills, had been combined into one figure, and he said he was prepared to erase it all. He said he wasn't offering another loan or extending the payment deadline. He meant he would erase it. He added that he could also arrange the little girl's operation, the one the insurance wouldn't cover, because he knew people there. Delaney sat still. She asked what he wanted. Hollis smiled and said he liked the way she went straight to the point. He said he had a fairly large house in the suburbs and needed a private housekeeper who would live there, cook, clean, and take care of the place, with no more washing dishes at night and no more cleaning offices before sunrise. He said the pay would be several times what she earned here. He said the little girl would have a room of her own. He said it was an opportunity most people could only dream of. Delaney set the glass of water down and said she appreciated the offer, but she wouldn't accept it. He asked why. She said she didn't think he was looking for a housekeeper. The room went silent for several seconds. Then Hollis smiled, and the smile remained just as polite as it had been at the beginning. Not a single feature changing. Yet to Delaney it looked entirely different. He said he understood, and that he had never been a man who forced anyone. He said he would give her 7 days to think about it. He said that if she still felt the same way after 7 days, he wouldn't do anything to her. He simply wouldn't be able to help anymore, and when help was no longer available, everything would naturally continue down its own path. She stood to leave, and then he added one more thing. He said she ought to think carefully because there were people who would very much like to free her from the burden of the little girl, and those people were far more patient than he was. Delaney turned and asked what he meant by that. Hollis merely shrugged and said he was speaking idly, then lowered his eyes to the papers on his desk, as though the conversation had ended. She reached home close to 1 o'clock in the morning. A white envelope lay on the steps beneath her door, one corner softened by the rain. She picked it up, opened it beneath the streetlight, and stood reading it while her legs refused to move. It was a summons from the Suffolk County Family Court. Sterling and Margot Ashcroft, the parents of the husband who had abandoned her, had filed a petition to change Junie Shaw's primary guardianship. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks later. Delaney read it a second time, then a third, and then she sat down on the steps, right where she stood, because her legs could no longer hold her. In 6 years, those two people had never made a single phone call, never sent a card, never asked how much the little girl had grown. Now they had filed a petition with the court. When Delaney opened the door, the kitchen light was still on, and Gray was sitting in his usual place with his back against the wall. He looked at her face, then at the paper in her hand. She placed it on the table and said nothing. He picked it up and read it. He read very quickly, and she noticed that his eyes moved down the page in a strange way, not from beginning to end, but jumping first to certain lines before returning to the rest. When he finished, he set the paper down. Then he reached up to his neck, removed the silver chain, placed the locket on the table beside the summons, and pushed it toward her. He said it was real silver, and that she should take it to the pawnshop on the main street and get whatever money she could for it. Delaney looked at the locket lying on the table, at the silver edges worn smooth from being held too many times over too many years. She pushed it back toward him and said it was the only thing he still had that belonged to who he had once been. And until he remembered who he was, she wouldn't let him sell it. That same morning, on the other side of the city, on the top floor of the old building in the north end, extra chairs had been placed around the long wooden table because more people than usual were expected. Rocco Castellano had called the meeting. He stood at the head of the table in a dark suit, and he waited until everyone had taken a seat before he began to speak. He said enough time had passed. He said they had searched the riverbed from the foot of the bridge all the way to the harbor mouth. Divers had gone down twice. The harbor police had issued a notice, and there had been nothing. He said the car had been found, but his brother hadn't. In the voice of a man forced to say something he didn't want to say, he told them that by now, everyone in the room knew what had happened, only no one had been willing to speak the words aloud. He said Gianni Castellano was dead. No one in the room spoke. Some lowered their heads. Some looked toward the windows. Near the far end of the table, the young woman from the Hargrove family sat motionless with her eyes fixed on the wood before her, and she was the only person in the room who didn't say a single word from beginning to end. Rocco continued, saying the family couldn't leave that place empty any longer. He said people outside were watching. The partners were asking questions. The banks were asking questions. And a family without a leader would be torn apart within weeks. He said he didn't want to take that seat. He said it twice, but he also said there was no one else. Then he walked around the head of the table, came to stand behind his brother's chair, and placed both hands on its back. Bruno Fazio rose. He had sat at that table since the days of Gianni's father. His hair had gone entirely white, and when he stood, the whole room turned to look at him. He didn't raise his voice. He only asked Rocco whether he could read the words carved into the surface of the table. Rocco told him not to play games with him. Bruno said he wasn't playing. He was asking honestly, because the third line was directly beneath the place where Rocco's hands were resting. Then he read it aloud, slowly, one word at a time. Whoever sits in the presiding chair must be named by the council. He said Rocco's father had sat in that chair only after 11 people in that room had spoken his name. He said Rocco's brother had sat in that chair only after everyone at the table had spoken his name, without a single exception. Then he looked around the room and asked whether anyone there had spoken Rocco's name that day. No one said anything. Rocco laughed, the way he always laughed when he felt cornered, and said, "Bruno, how long do you plan to protect this wooden table, while the entire family drifts away?" Bruno said that wooden table had held the family together longer than Rocco and Bruno's lives combined. Then he added that until there was a body in a coffin, no one was dead, and that chair still had an owner. Rocco remained standing there, with both hands still resting on the back of the chair. He looked at Bruno. He looked around the table once, studying every face, and he saw the thing he feared most. It wasn't that they opposed him. It was that they were waiting to see whether he dared to sit down. He removed his hands from the chair. He pulled out the chair beside it and sat there instead, then laughed and said, "All right." They would follow the rules. He wasn't in a hurry. He said he would wait until all the proper documents were in place. When the meeting ended, Bruno called Aldo Vetrano aside in the hallway. He asked the young man whether he remembered the boss ever removing that locket. Aldo said never, not even when he slept. Bruno nodded and said, then they were to keep the system running and never shut it down. Even if month after month passed without a signal, they still weren't to turn it off. Aldo asked whether he believed the boss was still alive. Bruno remained silent for a long time, then said he didn't believe anything. He only knew that until that machine made a sound, or until he saw the truth with his own eyes, he would keep that chair empty. The following evening, Delaney came home earlier than usual because the restaurant had been quiet, and she sat down at the kitchen table with Gray, and for reasons she couldn't understand, she told him everything. Perhaps it was because he was the only person left in that apartment she could tell. She told him about Hollis calling her into his office, about the way he'd poured her a glass of water, the way he'd asked after her little girl, then the stack of papers he'd placed on the desk, and his offer involving the house in the suburbs. She even told him about the 7-day deadline he'd given her. Gray listened to all of it without interrupting once. Then, when she had finished, he asked her a question, and the question made her pause. He asked whether Hollis calculated the interest by the week or by the day. She said by the week. He nodded and asked another question, his voice still as calm as though he were asking whether it had rained that day, whether anyone else's name appeared beneath her signature on the debt papers as a guarantor, or whether there was a seal, or a faintly printed name in the bottom corner. Delaney said she hadn't noticed. He said she should have. Then he asked a third question. He asked whether Hollis had ever handed her a blank sheet and told her to sign it first, so the amount could be filled in later. Delaney set down her cup. She looked at him. She asked how he knew to ask about those things. Gray didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his hands resting on the table, and she could see that he was asking himself the very same question she'd just asked him. Then he said he didn't know. He said that while she was telling him the story, those questions had simply risen into his mind, already arranged in the proper order, and he knew with absolute certainty that if she'd answered yes to the last one, then the situation was far more serious. But he couldn't explain why he knew. He said he didn't even know what a debt agreement designed to trap someone was supposed to look like. And yet he'd just asked her the exact 3 questions needed to find the trap. He lifted his eyes to hers and said the thing that frightened him wasn't that he'd forgotten who he was. He said what frightened him was everything that had refused to disappear with the rest of his memory. He said people claimed that losing your memory meant losing everything, but he hadn't lost everything. Some things inside him were still perfectly intact. Sharp, ready, only waiting for someone to touch them before they sprang to life, and he didn't know what those things were, or whether an ordinary person carried things like that inside them. More quietly, he said perhaps he hadn't been a good man. Delaney didn't know how to answer. She was about to say something when the curtain across the room was pulled aside, and Junie came out barefoot, holding a sheet of paper. She should have been asleep long ago. She hurried to the table, leaned against her mother's leg for a moment while she woke herself fully, then held the paper out toward Gray and said she'd drawn it for him. He took it. On the page were 2 people standing side by side, one with long hair drawn in brown crayon, the other much taller and drawn in black crayon, and above them was a large yellow circle with a curved handle. Gray asked who they were. Junie pointed to the figure with long hair and said that was Mommy, then pointed to the taller figure and said that was him. He asked where she was. The little girl thought for a moment, then said she was holding the crayon. so she couldn't draw herself into the picture. And then she laughed, the way children laugh when they realize they've just said something terribly funny. Delaney laughed with her and told her to go back to sleep. Junie said goodnight to Uncle Gray and slipped behind the curtain again. Gray remained seated there, holding the drawing in both hands. Delaney looked over and saw that his hands were trembling. It wasn't the trembling from cold she'd seen on the first day, but something different, something that began deep inside him, and he had to place the drawing on the table and lay both hands over it just to keep it still. He didn't say anything. Delaney didn't ask. She only thought that whoever this man had once been, perhaps this was the first time in his life that someone had given him something without asking for anything in return. The next morning, there was a knock at the door, and when Delaney opened it, Margot Ashcroft was standing on the steps with her purse in one hand, her eyes already looking past Delaney into the apartment before Delaney even had the chance to greet her. Delaney hadn't seen the woman since that summer when she was still pregnant. Margot didn't step inside, and she wasn't invited in. She stood there saying something about how she had only happened to be passing by, then asked where Junie went to school, then looked into the apartment again, and this time her gaze settled directly on the armchair in the farthest corner where Gray was sitting. She asked who he was. Delaney said he was her friend. Margot repeated, her friend, then asked what his name was, what he did, and how long he'd been staying there. Delaney asked whether she'd really come all this way just to ask those questions. Margot gave a faint, cold smile and said she was only concerned, then offered one final remark before turning away that surely she had a right to know what kind of home her granddaughter lived in and who lived there with her. After she left, Delaney remained standing in the doorway for a long time, and from inside the apartment, Gray asked who the woman had been. She said Junie's grandmother, then closed the door. That afternoon, Hollis summoned her. This time he didn't invite her to sit, didn't pour her water, and kept his words brief. He said the restaurant was making reductions that week. Several kitchen positions had to be eliminated, and he regretted it deeply, but there was nothing to be done. He told her to go downstairs, collect the remainder of her wages, and leave. Delaney asked whether this was because of what had happened the other day. Hollis looked at her and said in the same perfectly polite voice he'd used before that he had already told her. He never forced anyone. He was simply no longer helping. It was still daylight when she walked out of the restaurant. When she reached home, there was another notice on the door, this one white instead of yellow, a termination of tenancy requiring her to move out within 2 weeks. She finished reading it, folded it, and slipped it into her bag beside the court summons. She didn't cry. She went inside, pulled out several old cardboard boxes, and began packing. She emptied the cabinet first, then the shelf, then the tin box where she kept her papers. Inside was the stack of debt agreements she'd signed through Hollis over the years, and for the first time, she took all of them out and examined them instead of shoving them back inside and closing the lid. Her signature appeared on the bottom line. Hollis's signature was beside it. Then she remembered Gray's 3 questions, tilted the page toward the light, and in the lower right corner, printed so faintly and so small that she had to hold it close to her eyes to read it, there was a name. It wasn't Hollis's name. It was the name of some family she'd never heard of. She stared at it for a while without understanding what it meant, then folded the paper and placed it in her bag. When she reached the last drawer of the wooden cabinet, she had to yank hard because it had been stuck for years. Inside were several spools of thread, a broken pair of pliers, and at the very bottom, tucked against one corner, an envelope she'd never seen before. The paper had yellowed, and the edges had curled. Her name was written by hand across the front in handwriting she recognized immediately, even though she hadn't seen it in 6 years. A faded postmark remained in one corner. She sank to the floor with the envelope in her hands and stayed there for a very long time. Then she stood, went next door, and when Mrs. Willa opened the door, Delaney held up the envelope. She asked only one question. How long had this been inside her home? Mrs. Willa looked at the envelope. She didn't ask what Delaney meant, didn't pretend she knew nothing, and didn't offer a single excuse. She stepped back to let her inside, then sat down in a chair with both hands resting in her lap, and said she'd kept it for 6 years. She said Delaney's mother-in-law had intercepted it at her own house and given it to her, telling her to hide it and never let Delaney see it. Delaney asked why she'd listened. Mrs. Willa remained silent for a moment, then said it was because she'd read it. She said she knew what was inside. She said Delaney had been pregnant then, abandoned by her husband, standing alone in a hospital corridor, And she'd believed that if Delaney read that letter, she would sit there waiting for someone who would never come back. And Mrs. Willa couldn't bear the thought of it. She said she'd been wrong. She knew she'd been wrong, and she'd meant to tell Delaney so many times. But every time, the words had failed her. Delaney stood there holding the envelope, looking at the woman who had cared for her child for years without taking a single dollar, the only person in that city who had ever remained kind to her. She didn't open the envelope. She didn't say anything else. She only folded it, slipped it into her coat pocket beside the debt agreement, said she was going home, and walked out. The following afternoon, Delaney returned to the restaurant to collect the rest of the wages she was still owed, and Gray went with her because he said there was no point in sitting at home all day with nothing to do. He waited at the far end of the parking lot behind the kitchen while she went inside. She came out about 10 minutes later holding a paper-thin envelope, and Hollis followed her through the door. He called her name. She didn't turn around. He called again, hurried after her, and caught her by the wrist, not violently, but tightly enough to make her stop. He told her to quit being so stubborn. He said he'd offered her the most respectable way out anyone in her position could ever dream of, and she'd thrown it away because of her pride. Delaney tried to pull her hand free, but he wouldn't let go. She told him to take his hand off her. Hollis pulled her a little closer and lowered his voice, and there was nothing polite left in it now, and he said something she wouldn't fully understand until much later. He asked whether she thought he enjoyed doing things like this. He said he had no personal grudge against her, that she'd washed dishes for him for 3 years, and he'd never once spoken harshly to her. Then he said he wasn't the person who wanted this done. He was only the person being paid to do it, and the people paying him weren't nearly as patient as he was. Delaney went completely still and asked who they were. He never had the chance to answer. Footsteps sounded against the wet concrete, and Gray was suddenly standing beside them. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't lift a hand. He only leaned forward, brought his mouth close to Hollis's ear, and spoke one quiet sentence, so brief it lasted less than a single breath. Delaney stood only 1 step away, yet she couldn't hear a word of it. But she saw Hollis's face. The blood drained from it so quickly that she thought he was about to collapse. He released her wrist, as though he'd touched something burning. He stepped back half a pace, his eyes still fixed on Gray's face, and opened his mouth as though he meant to say something, then thought better of it. Then he turned and hurried toward the back door without looking over his shoulder once. On the way home, Delaney asked what he'd said to him. Gray said he didn't know where those words had come from. She told him he'd spoken with such authority just 5 minutes ago, but he only shook his head. He stopped in the middle of the sidewalk and told her honestly that he hadn't thought of the words before speaking them. The sentence had simply come out of his mouth, and once it was said, even he didn't understand what it meant. He only knew it was true. She looked at him and didn't ask anything else. That night, Gray said he was going out to buy a few things for breakfast the next morning. He left around 9 o'clock. It was nearly 11, and he still hadn't returned. Delaney looked outside several times, then asked Mrs. Willa to come over and watch Junie while she slept, and took a small flashlight with her to search for him. She walked the length of the block, turned past the grocery store that had already closed, then entered the alley behind it. She saw him the moment the beam of her flashlight swept across the darkness. He was sitting against the brick wall at the end of the alley, one arm wrapped around his left side, his head slightly bowed. The grocery bag lay several steps away, with a few broken eggs spilled across the concrete. Delaney ran to him, dropped to her knees, and called his name. He looked up and tried to smile. The corner of his lip was split. He said he was fine, and had only sat down to rest for a while. She asked who had done it. He said there had been 3 men, but he hadn't seen their faces clearly, and they hadn't taken anything. Delaney sank onto the wet concrete beside him, pulled a handkerchief from her pocket, and wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth. But her hand was trembling so badly that she had to try twice. She told him she was sorry. He asked what she was apologizing for. She said it was because of her, because he'd stepped between her and Hollis that afternoon. He had nothing to do with any of this. He couldn't even remember his own name, and she dragged him into the middle of her mess. She said she should have left him sitting where she'd found him, that she never should have brought him home. Her tears fell onto the back of her own hand without her noticing. Gray watched her in silence for a long time. Then he raised one hand, moving very slowly because every motion hurt, and took hold of her wrist, the same wrist Hollis had gripped that afternoon. He held it gently. Then he told her not to apologize. He said he couldn't remember anything, couldn't remember where he'd lived, couldn't remember whether there was anyone in the world who belonged to him, But there was one thing he knew with absolute certainty. He said that since the day he'd awakened beneath the riverbank, this was the first time anyone had cried for him. 3 days later, on an ordinary afternoon, Junie sat at the kitchen table coloring as she did every day. She was coloring a fish purple when she stopped, set the crayon down on the table, and said, "Mommy, I'm tired." Delaney was washing dishes at the sink. She turned to look at her daughter, and for 1 second she stood perfectly still. Then she shut off the water, dried her hands, lifted the little girl into her arms, and told Gray to help her put on her coat. They took the train because this time walking wasn't possible. The children's hospital was in Longwood, and when Delaney carried her daughter through the automatic glass doors, she didn't notice the bronze plaque mounted on the wall to the right, the plaque bearing the name of a pediatric cardiology department, and the name of the family that had funded it many years earlier, a surname that, even if she had read it, would have seemed only faintly familiar because she'd recently seen it printed in pale letters at the corner of a debt agreement. She carried Junie into the clinic. On the other side of the city, in the small room beside the Castellano family council chamber, the machine Bruno Fazio had ordered Aldo never to shut down after all these weeks suddenly made a sound. The device embedded inside the locket was passive, with no power source and no ability to transmit a signal on its own. It responded only when a scanning station operating on the private frequency of the Castellano family system passed close enough to reach it. Those stations were located at the headquarters, at the docks, in several buildings and institutions connected to the family, and there wasn't a single station anywhere in Dorchester or along the entire stretch of Quincy Point, because those were precisely the branches Gianni had ordered dismantled before he drove onto the Mystic Bridge. But the pediatric cardiology department the family had funded many years earlier did have one. Aldo rushed into the room, stared at the screen, then ran to find Bruno. The old man was drinking coffee at the far end of the hallway when he heard Aldo calling, and he rose so quickly that his chair toppled backward. He looked at the blinking point of light on the map, looked at the name of the hospital, then stood there for a very long time without being able to speak. Aldo asked whether it was really him. Bruno said, "Get the car." Meanwhile, in the hospital corridor, Delaney sat on a row of plastic chairs outside the examination room, her fingers intertwined in her lap. The doctor had told her everything she'd already heard, that the little girl's condition hadn't changed, that she needed surgery, and that the longer they waited, the more difficult it would become. Junie was inside with the nurse, playing with sheets of colored stickers and giggling. Gray sat down beside Delaney. He didn't ask what the doctor had said, because he'd already heard it. He remained quietly beside her for a long time, then lifted a hand to his neck and removed the silver chain for the second time. Delaney shook her head at once, and said she'd already told him she wouldn't sell it. Gray said he wasn't asking her to sell it. Holding the chain in both hands, he raised it over her head and placed it around her neck. The small silver locket settled against her shirt, old and worn, smooth along the edges. Delaney lifted a hand and touched it. She said it belonged to him. Gray said if it belonged to him, then he could give it to anyone he wanted. Then he continued in a calm voice, saying that he had nothing, no name, no home, no papers, not a single dollar, and he couldn't promise her the things a decent man ought to promise. He said he didn't know whether he would remember who he was tomorrow, and even if he did, he couldn't be certain whether that man had been good or bad. Then he looked directly into her eyes and said there was one thing he could promise. He told her to keep the locket, no matter where she had to move, no matter whether they drove her out of that apartment, no matter whether she had to leave the city, she should keep wearing it, because wherever she went, he would find her. Delaney laughed, a brief, weary sound, and said he couldn't even find his way back to his own home. Gray said that was true. Then he said he would still find her. The examination room door opened, and Junie ran out, wrapped her arms around her mother's legs, and proudly showed her a sheet covered with star stickers. Delaney lifted her daughter into her arms. The three of them walked down the corridor toward the exit, and none of them knew that outside, only a few streets away, 2 cars were racing toward that hospital. By the time the 2 cars reached the hospital, they were already gone. Bruno had his men ask at the reception desk, and it took less than an hour to trace the address listed in the medical records of a 5-year-old girl named Junie Shaw in Dorchester. Dusk had begun to settle when the 2 black cars stopped in front of the old row house, and in that narrow alley, they stood out from everything around them like 2 objects placed where they didn't belong. Delaney had just returned from the store with a bag of groceries in her hand, and she stopped abruptly on the steps, when she saw several men in suits getting out of the cars. Gray was sitting outside the door as usual. He rose when they approached. The man leading them was an old man with pure white hair and a slow gait, and halfway across the alley, he stopped. He stood there looking at Gray. He didn't say anything. The entire alley went silent. Then Delaney saw something happen to Gray. He looked at the old man, and his face went blank. Then he raised one hand and pressed it against his temple. He staggered back a step. He whispered a name, Bruno, then collapsed, one knee striking the concrete, and bent forward, gasping like a man who had been held beneath the water and dragged back to the surface. Delaney dropped the grocery bag and ran toward him, but the old man moved forward as well, and she stopped halfway because she didn't know whether she had any right to step into whatever was happening there. Gray remained that way for about a minute. Then he planted one hand against the ground and stood. He rose very slowly, but once he was upright, Delaney saw at once that something had changed. His shoulders opened, his chin lifted. He no longer leaned slightly forward the way he had throughout the past several weeks. He looked around the alley once, at the two cars, at every man standing beside them, and it was the look of a man who was counting, not the look of a man who was afraid. Then he opened his mouth, and the voice that came out wasn't the voice of the man who had sat eating at her kitchen table for weeks. He asked how long they'd been looking for him. Bruno Fazio stepped forward, and that old man, the man before whom all the others lowered their heads as he passed, placed one hand over his chest and went down on one knee in the middle of the wet alley. He said, "Welcome back, Mr. Chairman." Then he said they'd been searching for him since that night. His voice broke on the final word. The men standing behind him lowered their heads at the same time. Delaney stood there on the steps, still holding the grocery bag that had slipped halfway from her hand, staring at the scene before her while her mind struggled to understand it. The man standing in the middle of that alley was the same man whose hair she'd cut with the little scissors from her kitchen drawer less than 2 weeks earlier. She had given him the old shirt he was still wearing, the one that pulled tight across his shoulders. She had let him sleep on her mattress while she curled up in the armchair. She had placed in his hands the container of food that should have been her daughter's lunch. She had given him a name because he hadn't had one. And now an old man was kneeling before him and calling him sir. She watched him reach down and help the old man to his feet. She saw him say something brief, and Bruno nodded, stepped back, and waited. Then he turned to look at her. In that moment, Delaney understood something she would think about many times in the years that followed. He was still himself. The same face, the same gray eyes, the same shirt of hers stretched tightly across his shoulders. But she no longer dared to step down from the stairs. She remained where she was, one step above him, clutching the grocery bag against her chest, and heard herself ask in a very small voice whether he remembered now. He said yes. She asked what his name was. He was silent for a heartbeat. Then he said his name was Gianni Castellano. That night, he didn't leave. He told Bruno to send all the cars away and keep only one man posted at the end of the alley. Then he remained in that small kitchen until late. Delaney had gone to bed, or at least she had stepped behind the curtain and lain there without making a sound. He sat in his usual place with his back against the wall, and on the table before him lay the leather-bound ledger Bruno had ordered brought over at his request. He opened it. The ledger recorded the accounts of the Quincy Point branch, the operation that ran along the southern waterfront, the same branch he had signed an order to dismantle before driving onto the bridge. He turned the pages one by one. The borrowers' names were arranged in columns, followed by the dates of the loans, the amounts, the interest calculated by the week, and in the final column, the name of the person responsible for collecting the payments. One name appeared again and again in that last column, from one page to the next, and that name was Hollis Vandermeer. He kept turning the pages. Then he stopped. In the middle of one page, surrounded by dozens of other names and written in blue ink that had begun to fade, were 2 words: Delaney Shaw. Beside them was the date the account had been opened, and that date was 3 years earlier. Beneath it were lines recording every payment collected, week after week, steady and unbroken. Not a single week missed. Not even during the weeks when he knew the little girl had been in the hospital. Gianni sat staring at those 2 words for a very long time. He didn't turn another page. He lifted one hand and brushed his thumb across the name once, then closed his eyes. In his mind was the still warm container of food placed into his hands beneath the rain. In his mind were the hands marked by hard calluses and cracked skin at the fingertips. In his mind were the words spoken by the old woman next door, that the debt had grown larger than Delaney's entire yearly income. He opened his eyes and called Bruno inside. The old man entered, and Gianni pointed to the line on the page without saying a word. Bruno bent down and read it. When he finished, he looked up at Gianni, then looked around the tiny kitchen, at the old armchair in the corner, at the cloth curtain dividing the room, and he understood. He said, "Dear God." Gianni said that for 3 years, every week without fail, men from his own family had come to take money from this woman. He said that 3 days earlier, this woman had placed in his hands the container of food that should have been her daughter's lunch, while his hands were still shaking from hunger. He said she walked home for an hour because she was afraid to spend money on the train, and the reason she was afraid to spend that money was lying inside this ledger beneath his family name. Bruno said he hadn't known. Gianni said that was right. He hadn't known, and that was the worst part. He said his father had known every name in the ledger, while Gianni had known only the number at the bottom of each page. He closed the book and told Bruno to bring him every ledger the following morning, from every branch, without leaving out a single one, because he wanted to see how many more names like hers were hidden inside them. Bruno said yes, then asked one more question. What should be done about the man named Hollis? Gianni remained silent for a moment. Then he said that the previous afternoon, Hollis had gripped her wrist in the middle of the parking lot, and at the time, Gianni still hadn't remembered who he was. He had been nothing more than a nameless man standing there and watching. He said he'd leaned close to Hollis's ear and told him that he couldn't remember who he was, but Hollis had looked at his face and remembered. So between the two of them, which one was truly in trouble? He said that at the time, even he hadn't understood what he'd just said. Bruno told him that now he understood. Gianni said yes, now he did. The next morning, Delaney woke before the sky had fully brightened, as she did every day. She pulled back the curtain. The armchair in the farthest corner was empty. The mattress had been folded into a neat square and propped against the wall. The shirt that had been tied across his shoulders was carefully folded and placed on top of it. There was no note on the kitchen table, no message, nothing at all, only a drawing made with crayons placed neatly at the center of the table, all 4 corners lying flat as though someone had carefully smoothed them down, and on the paper were 2 people standing together beneath a yellow umbrella. Delaney stood looking at it for a very long time. Then she thought that, for the second time in her life, someone had left her behind. She picked up the drawing, slipped it between the pages of her daughter's coloring book, then went to wash her face and prepare for the morning shift as though it were any other day. 6 weeks passed, and he didn't return even once. Delaney moved into a smaller place at the end of the street, found a morning cleaning job in another office building, and never mentioned his name to anyone, not even to Junie. Not even on the days when the little girl pulled out her coloring book and asked where Uncle Gray had gone. On the morning of the hearing, she put on the nicest blouse she owned and went alone to Suffolk County Family Court. Junie stayed home with Mrs. Willa. Across the courtroom, Mr. and Mrs. Ashcroft sat beside each other, with 3 attorneys seated in front of them. Delaney had no one. The attorney for the petitioners rose, and he spoke very calmly and politely, never raising his voice once. He explained that his clients held no ill will toward the mother, and that this was purely a matter of practical circumstances. He read Delaney's work schedule aloud, the cleaning shift that began before sunrise and the evening shift that ended after midnight, then asked the court who remained with the child during all those hours. He said the person caring for the little girl was an elderly neighbor who wasn't registered with the state as a child care provider, which meant that on paper, there was no formal arrangement or legal accountability at all. He then presented records showing that Delaney's tenancy had recently been terminated, that the mother had just lost her job, and that an unpaid medical debt remained outstanding. Then he said his clients owned a home in Beacon Hill, had the financial means, had the time, and wanted only the opportunity to care for their granddaughter. He sat down. The judge asked whether the mother had anything to say. Delaney stood. She opened her mouth, but she didn't know what to say because everything they had just said was true. The judge looked at her, then lowered his eyes to the case file and began the opening sentence of his ruling. The door at the back of the courtroom opened. Footsteps crossed the wooden floor, several people walking at once. Delaney turned, and she went completely still. Gianni Castellano walked in the middle of them, wearing a dark suit, his hair neatly cut, with 4 attorneys carrying briefcases and files behind him. He walked directly to the front row, asked the court's permission to submit additional evidence, and the lead attorney began placing each item on the clerk's table. The first was a copy of Mrs. Willa Petrosky's valid pediatric nursing license issued by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, together with records documenting 31 years of service in the pediatric departments of 2 hospitals in the city, accompanied by an application to operate as a child care provider that had already been filed and accepted. The second was a 3-year lease for a 2-bedroom apartment in Dorchester under the name Delaney Shaw, with the rent paid in full for the entire term. The third was written confirmation from the hospital that every medical debt associated with the child had been paid and closed, with no remaining balance. The fourth was a letter from the pediatric cardiology department, confirming that the surgery had been scheduled and that another party had agreed to cover the cost. The petitioner's attorney stood and asked who that party was. Gianni rose and said he was. The judge asked what relationship he had to the respondent. The entire courtroom waited in silence. Gianni said he wasn't related to her in any way. He said this woman's name had appeared in his company's ledgers for 3 years, with an entry recorded every single week, and throughout those 3 years, he had never once seen her face. He said he'd looked only at the number at the bottom of the page. Then he said he hadn't come there that day to help anyone. He had come to repay a debt, and in his family, there was one rule. His family never owed anyone. The judge looked at him for a long time. Then he reviewed the documents that had just been submitted, asked the petitioner's attorney whether he had any objection to them, and the attorney sat down without saying another word. The petition to change primary guardianship was denied. In the hallway, Delaney hurried toward Gianni with 100 questions she wanted to ask, the first of them being why he'd left without saying a word. She didn't get the chance. They had just reached the stone steps outside the courthouse when she saw him falter. He reached out for something to hold on to, but there was nothing there. Then he collapsed on the steps, and the files in the hands of the attorney walking beside him scattered across the ground. The doctor met Delaney in the hallway because Bruno had told him she was family. He said that on the night they pulled Gianni from the river, several places inside his chest had already been badly damaged, and he hadn't stayed still for even 1 day to let them heal. He said Gianni had suffered another impact after that. He hadn't asked where it happened, but the blow had landed directly over the original injury. Then he told her plainly that Gianni's body had reached its limit, and if he pushed himself that hard one more time, the doctor couldn't be certain he would wake up again. Delaney stood there listening with one hand gripping the back of a chair. She asked what Gianni had done that day that could be called overexertion. The doctor said he didn't know, but he'd been told Gianni had spent the entire morning riding in a car to reach some courthouse, even though the doctor had ordered him to remain in bed. She went into the room and sat beside him. He woke late that afternoon, and the first thing he asked was how the hearing had gone, which nearly made her cry because he'd been there. He already knew the outcome, but he'd collapsed immediately afterward and wasn't certain. She told him it was all right. It was over. He said good, then closed his eyes again. After a while, she reached up to her neck, removed the silver chain, and placed the locket in his palm. She said she'd kept it for the past 6 weeks, worn it every day, and every day she'd looked at the words engraved on the back. She said she couldn't read them and didn't know whom to ask, so she'd kept trying to guess. She asked what they meant. Gianni lifted the locket, turned it over, and stared at the back for a long time before answering. Then he said it was Italian. It meant, "Come home." She asked what the letter G stood for. He said it wasn't Gianni. Delaney sat up straighter. He said the G stood for Julia. That was his mother's name. Then he began to tell her. And he spoke in the steady voice of a man who had repeated the story in his own mind thousands of times, but had never once said it aloud to another person. He said his mother hadn't belonged to that world. She had married his father and given birth to him, but his father's family had never accepted her because in that house everything was measured by blood and position, and she had neither. When he was a child, they forced her out of the house and kept him behind. He said they told him his mother had abandoned him. He believed it for many years. He said it wasn't until he was older that he finally uncovered the truth, and what he discovered was that she had never left the city. She had stayed. Season after season, she walked the streets around the neighborhood where the house stood with her son living inside it, unable to enter, unable to call him. Then one winter, they found her in a shelter on the western side of the city. He said the last words she ever spoke to him were the words engraved on the back of that locket. She said them as they dragged her away from the door. She told him to wait, that she would come home. He fell silent for a while. Then he said the thing that kept him awake wasn't that winter. He said the thing that kept him awake was knowing that during all those months she sat on the streets of that city. Thousands of people passed her every day, People came home from work. People went to the market. People stepped around her. And through all those months, through all those thousands of people, not one person stopped for her. He turned his head and looked at Delaney. He said that day he remembered nothing. He didn't remember his name, didn't remember his mother, didn't remember that winter. He said he only sat there knowing with absolute certainty that he would remain there until darkness came. Then he said she bent down, handed him the container of food, and tilted the umbrella toward him. He said he'd cried then without understanding why. He said now he understood. Then he spoke softly, almost to himself, and said that after all those years and all those people, she was the first person who had ever stopped. 3 days later, Rocco called an emergency council meeting on the grounds that the future of the lending branches had to be decided before the end of the month, and he chose the very day the doctor had forbidden Gianni to leave his bed. Bruno arrived at the hospital early that morning. After Gianni heard what had happened, he lay still for a while, then told Bruno to take her there. Bruno asked him to repeat himself. Gianni said Bruno was to take Delaney in his place. Bruno said she knew nothing about those matters. Gianni said that was true. She knew nothing at all, and that was precisely the reason. He told Bruno simply to bring her there and have her stand in that room. She didn't need to say anything. The only thing that mattered was for everyone in that room to see whom he had chosen to send. Delaney sat in the car throughout the drive to the north end with her fingers clenched around the strap of her bag. She wore the same blouse she'd worn to court because she didn't own another one. When the elevator doors opened on the top floor, she could hear voices carrying from the meeting room, and Rocco was standing in the doorway. He looked her over from head to toe, then smiled and asked Bruno whom he'd brought there. Bruno said she was Mr. Chairman's representative. Rocco said he knew her. He said she was the woman who washed dishes down in Quincy Point. Then he said this was the council chamber, and anyone could cross that threshold, but anyone who opened their mouth inside had to have a name in the ledger, and he was certain hers wasn't there. Delaney stood with her face burning, and she was about to turn away when Bruno stepped in front of her. The old man entered the room, walked directly to the head of the long wooden table, and placed the leather-bound ledger on its surface. The entire room fell silent. He opened it, turned to the exact page he needed, then rotated the book so everyone could see. He invited Rocco to read it. Rocco leaned down, and his face changed. In the middle of the page, beneath the faded writing, was the name Delaney Shaw. Beside it, written in fresh black ink that hadn't faded at all, was a line Gianni himself had added on the night he'd sat in the small kitchen in Dorchester. Bruno read it aloud for the entire room. He said her name wasn't listed under members. Her name appeared under unpaid debts, and the person who had written it there was the chairman himself. Then he placed one hand on the tabletop, directly over the first line carved into the wood, and recited the first law. This family never owes anyone. He looked up at Rocco and said that until this debt had been repaid, this woman stood there as a creditor. And in that family, a creditor spoke with the voice of the person who owed the debt. He said anyone who disagreed should raise a hand. Rocco looked around the table. He raised his hand first. 2 men followed him, then 1 more, and then no one else. Bruno stood. Aldo stood. Then, one by one, the people around that wooden table rose from their chairs, the legs scraping across the floor, until only Rocco and the 3 men beside him remained seated. Delaney stood in the doorway with her hand still gripping the strap of her bag, and she didn't fully understand what had just happened, but she understood that everyone in that room had risen because of a line a man had written in a ledger at midnight in her kitchen. Near the far end of the table, the young woman from the Hargrove family also rose with the others, and she was the only person among those seated near Rocco who hadn't raised her hand before. The meeting ended. Everyone began to leave, and while Delaney stood waiting for the elevator, the young woman stopped beside her. She looked down at the locket around Delaney's neck, then said quietly that Delaney shouldn't imagine having her name in that ledger was something fortunate. She said some people were born with their names already written inside it. They hadn't asked for it, they couldn't refuse it, and they had to live with that name for the rest of their lives. Then she told Delaney that she was far luckier than she was, and walked away. Delaney watched her go and understood none of it. Junie had been admitted to the hospital the previous afternoon to prepare for surgery the morning after next, and Mrs. Willis stayed with the little girl so Delaney could go home and collect more clothes. She was walking toward the train station when a car pulled up close to the curb, and a man stepped out to open the rear door, telling her that Mr. Castellano had asked to see her. She asked which Mr. Castellano. The man didn't answer. The car didn't head toward the hospital, nor did it go toward the north end. It followed the waterfront, then turned into the Charlestown Harbor District, where rows of old warehouses stood silent behind steel fences. And when the car door opened, Delaney saw Rocco Castellano waiting in the middle of an empty warehouse, overhead lights casting a weak yellow pool across the floor, with tarpaulin-covered crates surrounding him. He smiled and told her to sit down, saying there was a chair. She didn't sit. She asked what he wanted. He said he didn't want anything from her at all. She had merely happened to become something valuable. Then he looked at his watch and said his brother would probably be arriving soon. Gianni came about 20 minutes later. He entered alone. Bruno wasn't with him, Aldo wasn't with him, and no one followed behind him. He walked slowly, one hand resting slightly against the edge of a crate as he passed, and Delaney could see clearly that he shouldn't have been there in his condition. Rocco clapped twice and said it was good that his brother had kept his word, then pointed toward a table in the middle of the warehouse. A prepared stack of documents and a pen lay on top of it. He said Gianni would sign there, transfer all operational authority and controlling power to him, and then she could go home. It was that simple. He said he wouldn't hurt her, that he wasn't that kind of man. Gianni walked toward the table. He looked at the documents. Then he picked up the pen, and Delaney felt her heart tighten because she thought he was truly going to sign. He held the pen for a moment, then he placed it upright on the tabletop, let it fall flat, and pushed it toward Rocco. He said, "You want this name?" He said, "Fine. But this name has laws. And the first law is that the Castellano family never owes anyone, while the law you've forgotten is that the Castellano family doesn't trade human lives for papers." He said that if he signed those documents today, what Rocco took home wouldn't be the family. It would only be a stack of papers bearing the signature of a man who had betrayed the laws of his own house, and Rocco would carry that stack to the wooden table and place it before more than a dozen people who had sat there longer than both of their lives combined. Rocco told him to be quiet. Gianni said that the previous week, Rocco had placed his hands on the back of the chair but hadn't dared sit down. He asked how long Rocco had stood there and whether he'd counted. He said that if Rocco wanted that chair, the only way to claim it was to stand in the middle of that room and ask the council to speak his name, not drag a woman into a warehouse. He said Rocco didn't dare. And the reason he didn't dare wasn't because he feared Gianni. He didn't dare because he knew perfectly well that if he'd opened his mouth and asked that day, not one person in the room would have spoken his name. Rocco stood motionless. His face was deathly pale beneath the lights. Then he laughed. The same laugh he always used when cornered, and said Gianni spoke beautifully, that he'd always spoken better than Rocco, ever since they were children. But today, he said, Gianni was standing inside Rocco's warehouse. At that exact moment, the lights went out. The entire warehouse plunged into darkness in a single instant. Then the steel door on the eastern side was wrenched open. Flashlight beams swept in from 3 directions at once, and someone shouted that this was the Boston Harbor Police, and everyone was to remain still. Gianni had already moved toward Delaney before the lights went out, and he pulled her down behind a crate, one hand gripping her shoulder. Amid the pounding footsteps and shouted orders, Delaney heard him speak close to her ear, saying he was sorry and that he never should have allowed any of this to reach her. When the lights came back on, Rocco's men were being led outside, and Bruno stood at the warehouse entrance beside an officer. But at the far end of the building, the side door leading onto the pier stood wide open, swinging in the wind. Rocco was no longer there. The following night, on the inpatient floor, someone wearing a white medical coat walked down the corridor at the exact moment the shifts were changing, stopped at the last room, and did what they had been paid to do. Delaney was sitting 1 floor below, outside the waiting room before Junie's surgery, when she heard the alarm shrieking from above and echoing down the stairwell. She ran upstairs. She caught only a glimpse of several people in blue uniforms rushing a bed past her before the emergency room doors closed directly in front of her, and she remained there with one hand gripping the wall until someone came and led her somewhere else to sit. By the following morning, the news had spread across the city. Rocco Castellano appeared before the cameras wearing the expression of a man who had lost his brother for the 2nd time, announced that the family would hold a private memorial service, and scheduled the formal reading of the will at headquarters for the end of the week. Delaney went there that morning because Aldo had sent her a single message containing only an address and a time, nothing more. In the council chamber on the top floor, the chair at the head of the long wooden table had been covered with a black cloth, but Delaney never saw it, because she couldn't even reach the doorway. Rocco was already waiting in the hallway. He asked what she was doing there. She said she had come to say goodbye to him. Rocco laughed and said that the last time, Bruno had taught his entire family a lesson about their laws, and now he would return the favor. He said she'd been allowed to stand there because she spoke with the chairman's voice, but that right had ended the moment the chairman died. As for the debt in the ledger, he said debts belonged to people, and when the person died, the debt died with him, so no one owed her anything anymore. Then he gave a signal. 2 men stepped across the doorway, and the heavy wooden door closed. Delaney stood in the hallway before the stone steps leading up to the entrance. She remained there for a very long time. Then she reached up to her neck, removed the silver chain, and knelt to place the locket neatly on the stone step beneath the door, with the engraved side facing upward. She spoke through the closed door, not loudly, her voice steady as though she were speaking to someone sitting just beyond it. She said he'd once told her to keep wearing it because wherever she went, he would find her. She said now it was her turn to find him, but she didn't know the way. She said she didn't know where they had taken him. No one would tell her, and she had no right to ask. She said she was returning it to him because it belonged to his mother, and she had been waiting a very long time for him to come home. Then Delaney said one final thing. She said that if, in another life, he ever had to sit alone in the rain the way he had that day, he should remain right where he was, because she would still stop, and she would still tilt the umbrella toward him. She rose, turned away, and took 3 steps. Then she heard the hinges move. The heavy wooden door opened behind her. Delaney turned, and she saw that everyone in the council chamber was standing, not a single person still seated, and at the head of the table, the black cloth had been pulled away and lay crumpled on the floor, while Gianni Castellano sat in the chairman's chair. He had been there from the beginning of the meeting. The person in the medical coat the night before had been watched by Bruno's men from the moment they entered the hospital grounds, and the contents of the syringe had been replaced with saline several hours earlier. The screaming alarm and the closing emergency room doors had all been staged under Gianni's direct instructions. He had needed Rocco to believe. He had needed everyone in that room to hear the things Rocco had just said in the hallway, but he hadn't told her. He rose from the chair and walked toward the door slowly, supporting himself with one hand against the backs of the chairs as he passed. He descended the stone steps, bent down, and picked up the locket. Then he turned back toward the room, looked at every face, one by one, and spoke in a voice so quiet that the entire hallway heard him clearly. He said everyone in that room had heard her. He said the person who had cried for him wasn't inside that room at all. The person who had cried for him was standing outside the door, and the reason they had barred her from entering was that her name didn't appear in a ledger. He closed his hand tightly around the locket and said, "Then burn the ledger." No one in the council chamber moved. Then, near the far end of the table, the young woman from the Hargrove family rose and walked to the head of the long wooden table. She placed a small recording device on its surface. She said her name was Priscilla Hargrove, and she told everyone in the room that her father owed the Castellano family a debt he couldn't repay, and that Rocco had held that debt over them for more than a year. She said he'd told her to remain silent, to keep her eyes lowered toward the table, and that once everything was over, she would be seated in the place she'd dreamed of occupying all her life. Then she looked at Gianni and said she'd once wanted to become his wife, and she wouldn't deny it. But she didn't want to become the wife of a man if gaining him required her to stand by in silence and watch someone else die. She pressed the button. Rocco's voice filled the room, unmistakably clear, discussing the night on the Mystic Bridge, the mechanic, the payment made in advance, and the payment that would follow afterward. Everyone listened from beginning to end. When the recording finished, Bruno placed a thick stack of documents on the table and said there was more. He said that under the chairman's orders, he'd spent the past several months reviewing every lending branch, and he had traced the flow of money through the Quincy Point operation. He said Hollis Vandermeer hadn't acted on his own. Someone had hired him. Bruno spoke the name aloud. Sterling Ashcroft, he said. Mr. Ashcroft had paid Hollis to pressure one person and one person alone, to keep squeezing her until she was exhausted enough to sign away custody of her child voluntarily, because that would be cleaner than going to court and far more certain than winning a case. He said the network Mr. Ashcroft had used to accomplish it, where the money had passed and where the records had been kept, was now known to everyone in that room. Delaney stood outside the doorway listening, one hand gripping the wooden frame. For 3 years, she'd believed she was merely one name among countless borrowers, one unfortunate person among the thousands of unfortunate people in that city. But she hadn't been. Someone had chosen her specifically. Then Bruno said there was another voice on the recording, and he played the final section again. Another man's voice could be heard, rough and strained, talking about cutting the brakes and saying he would do it only this once and never again. Bruno called his name. Wyatt Ashcroft. The side door opened, and the man entered with 2 police officers. He was thin, his hair prematurely gray, and when he saw Delaney standing in the doorway, he stopped in the middle of the room. He said he would confess to everything. He said he had been a mechanic at the garage where the family had taken its cars for many years, that he'd lost money gambling, borrowed everywhere he could, and that Rocco had bought every one of those debts before placing a choice in front of him. Then he turned toward Delaney and said there was one more thing, something that had nothing to do with the court, but something he wanted to say in front of her. He said that 6 years earlier, his parents had paid off all his debts once before, and they'd attached one condition to the money. He had to leave. He had to abandon her and the child she was carrying. He said he'd taken the money. He said he'd left that day and hadn't dared return even once. Delaney stood there, and her hand moved instinctively into her coat pocket, to the place where she'd kept the yellowed envelope for weeks without finding the courage to open it. She pulled it out. She tore the envelope open in the middle of the hallway, in front of every person there. There was no letter inside. There was only a check, folded in half, made out in Wyatt's name, signed by his father, and dated during the summer when Delaney had been pregnant. The check had never been stamped, never been cashed, and never been spent. He had mailed it back to her and left with nothing. Delaney held that piece of paper and understood something she'd misunderstood for 6 years. She hadn't been abandoned. She had been bought away. From the far end of the room came the slow footsteps of an elderly woman, and Concetta Castellano entered, leaning on her cane, looking at no one except her youngest grandson. Rocco called to her. He called twice and begged her to save him. She stopped in front of him. She placed one hand on the wooden table, directly over the second carved line, and read it aloud. Blood can't buy loyalty. She said she loved both of her grandsons equally, and she would continue loving him until the day she closed her eyes. Then she said she couldn't protect evil. Rocco, Hollis, and Sterling Ashcroft were escorted from the building that very afternoon. That afternoon, after the building had emptied, Delaney stood facing Gianni in the hallway outside the council chamber, beside the stone steps where she had knelt that morning. She asked whether he'd heard her. He said yes. She asked whether he'd heard everything, from beginning to end, even the part about another life. He said yes. She said, "So you sat inside that room, separated from me by one door, watched me take that chain from my neck, listened to me say goodbye to a man who was still alive, and you call that protecting me?" He didn't argue. He didn't say that if she'd known, Rocco would have known too, even though it was true. He only stood there looking at her, then said that all his life, he'd learned only one way to keep other people safe, and that was to tell them nothing. He said his father had done it that way, and he'd done the same, and he'd never once thought it was wrong until that morning, when he'd sat behind that door and listened to her speak. He told her he was sorry, and said it was the first time in his life he'd ever spoken those words to anyone. Delaney remained silent for a long time, then said that next time, he had to tell her first. Even if they were going to die, he had to tell her first. He said all right. A few days later, Mrs. Concetta asked Delaney to visit her. She poured tea, asked about the little girl, then took a signed check from her purse with the amount left blank, placed it on the table, and pushed it toward Delaney. She told her to write in any amount she wanted. She said she'd just lost one grandson because of money, and she didn't want to lose the other because of anything at all. Delaney looked at the check, then pushed it back and said she hadn't taken Gianni's money when he had nothing to his name, and she certainly wouldn't take it now that he had everything. Then she added that she didn't want to become the reason Mrs. Concetta lost another grandson either. So if she truly believed Delaney wasn't right for him, she should say so, and Delaney would leave. Mrs. Concetta said nothing. She simply picked up the check and tore it in half in front of her. On the morning Junie went into surgery, Delaney sat alone on a row of chairs in the 5th-floor hallway, her hands clasped together in her lap. She had been sitting that way for about an hour when the elevator doors opened. Gianni stepped out, walking slowly, and in his hand was her old yellow umbrella, the one with the broken handle wrapped in tape, except now it had been fitted with a new wooden handle. He didn't say anything. He sat in the chair beside her, leaned the umbrella against the side of the seat, and remained there with her for several hours without speaking a single word. He simply stayed. When the doctor came through the doors and said the surgery had gone well and the little girl was stable, Delaney folded forward and began to cry, and Gianni still said nothing. He only reached out and steadied her by the shoulders. That afternoon, Mrs. Concetta arrived carrying a basket of food she'd cooked herself, and she sat beside Delaney in the hallway. She said she'd been afraid. She said she'd been so afraid that whenever she looked at someone, all she could see was a person trying to take something from her family, and because of that fear, she'd treated Delaney unjustly. Then she said that understanding wasn't the same as forgiveness, so she hadn't come to ask Delaney to understand her. She had come to ask Delaney to forgive her. Delaney took the elderly woman's hand and said she already had. A few months later, in the courtyard of a small church in the North End, Delaney and Gianni were married before, about 30 guests, and Junie walked ahead of them, carrying the yellow umbrella with its new handle, her face solemn as though she had been entrusted with a task of the greatest importance. Before that day, the leather-bound ledger and every other ledger like it had been burned in the courtyard behind the headquarters before the entire council. Every lending branch had been dissolved, and a foundation bearing Junie's name had been created to cover the cost of heart surgery for children throughout the city, along with a program providing free legal assistance to workers whose employers had pressured them into signing debt agreements. In front of everyone, Gianni said he loved Delaney not because she'd saved him, but because on the day when he no longer had even a name, she had still treated him like a human being. Delaney said she'd loved him when he was still gray, and she loved him now. Money had never made him worth more in her eyes. Only his heart could do that. This story leaves us with a few very simple truths. A person's dignity isn't found in the clothes they wear. True kindness is the kindness we offer when we have almost nothing to spare ourselves. And no one in this world has the right to measure another human being by the amount of money in their pocket. If this story has touched your heart, please press the like button, share it with the people you love, and subscribe to our channel so you can hear new stories every day. Please leave a few words in the comments below and tell us how you feel about Delaney and Gianni. We sincerely hope to hear the deepest thoughts in your heart. May you always be blessed with good health, peace, and happiness each day. Goodbye, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next video.